Okay, so learn a little bit more about variables. Understand concepts of classes and objects. How do you call a method? We'll get a definition of what a method is. I think we've talked about methods already. Learn about parameters, return values. Be able to look at the API. We might look at test programs. I guess we'll have to. And understand the difference between objects and object references. Now last time, or at least our homework assignment, was to create a window where we could actually draw on. So we're going to take a look also in this chapter on how to go about doing that. I kind of like graphical stuff rather than just text-based stuff. It's harder to grade, but it's easier to put something visual on the screen. That there's this concept of data type, and what a data type does is it tells you what kind of values you can store into it. There's lots of data types. There's the int data type, stands for integer. So you can think of these as whole numbers. They're positive, they're negative, they're zero. All are included in the int data type. But no fractional portion, no decimal point, no things off to the right. Another thing we talk about a lot is strings. And what a string is just a sequence of characters. So if you want to say hello world, we saw that we delimit a string using double quote. And then we have objects that we use all the time. We use system.out specifically. Java has separate types for whole numbers, and they call them floating point numbers. That's kind of specific. I tend to call them real numbers, numbers that have a fractional portion. And so the data types you'll see is double, which doesn't really describe what it stores, but what it tells you is this is a double precision floating point number, or this is a double precision number that has a decimal point and things to the right. It's another way to say it. There's also another type called float, which sounds better, and that's a single precision floating point number. It's got a little bit less range, or a lot, I guess, range of numbers it can store. Now you can just type numbers directly into Java, and it takes that number and translates it to binary and feeds it into the program. So the number 13 or the number 1.3, that's called a number literal. And literals are like, this is literally the number 13. This is literally the number 1.3. So you're making it kind of a mandatory thing. So what happens when the Java compiler comes across a number literal? It has to convert it into a certain data type. So if you look here, if you put the number 6 in your code, it sees that there's no decimal point and no 0 or anything to the right. So it assumes that it's an integer data type with no fractional part. If you put in -6, again it notices there's no decimal point and anything off to the right, so it puts it as an integer as well. So integers can be positive, negative, or 0, all of those. Here this is a double. If it sees that, it's assuming it's a number with a fractional part, so it automatically promotes it to be a double data type. Here's 1.0. What that says is, yeah, I know this is a whole number, but since the decimal point is there and there's a 0 after it, the compiler will say, oh, this is a double, even though it's a whole number. Because you put the decimal point in and the 0, it makes it a double. You can also put in numbers in scientific notation. So if you want to represent the number 1 million in scientific notation, you could write it in like this, 1e6, and that gets interpreted by the compiler to be a double, and it's using exponential notation. So if you do a lot of science stuff with your coding, you could run across this quite a lot. Can you have negative exponents? And the answer is yes. So you put in the number you want, e meaning 10, raised to the -2. That's also a double. Common mistake that programmers or beginning programmers make is they put commas in to separate thousands. That doesn't fly in the compiler. The compiler gets really confused. So you're just going to have to count zeros. You can't use comma as a decimal separator. Nor can you do fractions like this. The computer doesn't know what you mean. You can't use fractions. You can't even put a... There's also this idea of an implied multiplication operator. So if you say 2c, you know that means 2 times c. Computer doesn't know about that. You have to be more explicit. we've talked about types already. The type defines what values and operations can be done with this value. Now the number types are primitives or primitive types. That means they're not objects. Okay, so primitive types are not objects. You hear Java teachers say everything in Java is an object, and that's not true. There's a few things that aren't, and this is one of those things that isn't. It's called a primitive type. So numbers are not objects, like int and double. Strings are objects, but numbers like that are not objects. You can also combine numbers with arithmetic operators like plus, minus, and multiplication. Notice they didn't say division. I wonder why they didn't. I guess it's not a complete list. Here's our first self-check. Ask yourself this question. What is the type of values for the literal 0 and the literal 0 in quote? Well, if we look back at our chart, we see that we have 0. We see that that's interpreted as an integer. So if the compiler comes across a 0 in your code, it's going to convert that to an integer and store it as the binary representation of 0. The second one is a string because it's delimited by double quotes. So you know that's a string. So it's not the number 0, it's the symbol 0, which has a different ASCII code. If you're in my computer hardware class, that's what we were talking about the other day. So what number type would you use for storing the area of a circle? My son was actually doing this last night on his programming assignment over at Tigard High School, and trying to figure out how to store this. So what do you think? Should it be a string? Should it be a double or an integer? What would be a good data type for the area of a circle? Well, typically this kind of number, you're multiplying it times pi, right? Pi r squared, there it is. Yeah, double. That's correct, because if you're multiplying by pi, well, that has a fractional portion to the right that never ends. Pi r squared is the area of a circle. Probably best to use a double data type. So that's our answer, double. Yeah, I was upstairs in the Renaissance Teacher Cluster, and we were having lunch, and all the math teachers were having pi, because it was Pi Day. You know when Pi Day is? It's like March 14th, I think, is Pi Day. So they're all eating pies, and I came into the room, and I get angry and says, I think celebrating Pi Day is irrational. And then I leave. That's one of my favorite jokes that I made up and stuff. My family knows me as just the creator of some of the worst jokes on the planet. But I like geeky jokes like that. Did you read the one on the board? For every 10 people in the world, one person understands binary and the other one doesn't. Terrible. Why is this expression an error? Well, typically in Java, the thing next to the period on the left is an object. The thing on the right is a method. Well, 13 is not an object. Remember, it's a primitive type. 13 gets evaluated into an integer, and the integer doesn't have any methods, so this would fall on its head. Better way to do this is you would say system.out.println, and then in the parentheses you'd put in 13. Write an expression to compute the average of the values x and y. Okay. Now expression, do they talk about this in math class? An arithmetic expression? This idea of expressing something? Maybe that's unique to programming. How would you write it and figure out the formula? Well, definition of the average is, or mean, is to, or take the numbers, add them together, and divide by the number of numbers you have. Right, so how would you write that in Java? X plus y times 0.5. Yeah, that's not what I expected. You can see them consciously trying to avoid the divide symbol. So this is kind of clunky. There is a way to do division in Java. I think there's two ways, and they don't want to confuse you, so they're leaving it out for now. Dividing by 2 and multiplying by 0.5 will give you the same answer.